War Thunder has an Abrams problem, and it comes down to how the Trophy Abrams is being represented. Many players refer to the Trophy Abrams as an Abrams version 2, but that isn't an accurate depiction of what it actually is. The Abrams upgrades and systems added to this variant push it closer to a version 3 level configuration, rather than just another improved Abrams. In this video, I will break down the differences between the variants, what the trophy system changes, and why this matters for War Thunder balance and realism. I will also go over the problems with the Abrams and armor and the way it plays in game. So with further ado, let's get started. There is a problem with the Abrams in War Thunder, and it is not just about armor, reload speed, or whether it can compete at top tier. The problem is that the Abrams we are getting does not seem to match the version it is being called. The Trophy Abrams has been one of the most controversial additions because a lot of people have been calling it an Abrams V2, or a SEP V2. But when you start looking at the details, the label becomes questionable. One of the biggest examples of this is the Crow's machine gun system. Now at first glance, some people might look at the Crows and say it's just a machine gun mount, why does this matter? But that is exactly where the problem is. In War Thunder, especially when talking about modern military vehicles, the small details are what tell you what version of a vehicle you are actually looking at. The Crows, or Common Remotely Operated Weapon System, is not just a cosmetic change. It represents a major upgrade in how the tank operates. Instead of the commander having to expose themselves to use the machine gun, the weapon can be controlled inside the tank. This means better survivability, better awareness, and better battlefield capability. And this is where the Trophy Abrams debate starts. The argument is not that adding Trophy automatically makes the Abrams a V3. That's not how upgrades work. Trophy is an active protection system that can be added to different vehicles. The problem is when you combine Trophy with other upgrades that belong to newer Abrams modernization packages. The Crow system is one of those upgrades. The M1A2 SEP V2 and the M1A2 SEP V3 are not just different names. They represent different changes in systems, improved electronics, and changed designs to keep the Abrams competitive against newer threats. So when you use a vehicle with equipment associated with a V3 package, it raises a serious question. Are we actually looking at a version 2 Abrams with Trophy, or are we looking at something closer to a version 3? Because those are two very different things, and this matters in War Thunder. A lot of people think this is just a debate and players asking for a better tank. That's not really the point. The point is consistency. If Gaijin adds a vehicle, players expect it to represent a specific real-world configuration. If it is labeled as one variant but has equipment from another, then the classification becomes confusing. Imagine if Gaijin added a vehicle called a Leopard 2A6, but gave it systems from a Leopard 2A8. People would obviously question it. The same logic applies here. The Abrams has always had this problem because there are so many upgrade packages. The United States has constantly modernized the Abrams instead of replacing it completely. This means that two tanks can look almost identical while having major differences internally. The Trophy Abrams is a perfect example of this. From the outside, someone might say it's just another Abrams with APS, but when you start looking closer, you see the Crow system, the modernization features, and equipment choices that tell a different story. And that's why calling it a simple version 2 or Abrams SEP V2 doesn't really make sense. Now, does this mean that the Trophy Abrams should never have been added to War Thunder? No. The Abrams needs modernized variants. Top tier needs more realistic progression, but the vehicles need to be represented correctly. If Gaijin wants to add a V3 level Abrams, then add a V3 level Abrams. Give it the correct name, the correct equipment, and then balance it appropriately. The issue is when the vehicle becomes a mixture of different upgrade packages and players expected just to accept that classification. Because once you start mixing generations of upgrades, you create a problem. You are no longer talking about a specific vehicle, you're talking about a hybrid. And the hybrids are where War Thunder balance gets complicated. The Crow system might look like a small detail, but it shows a much bigger issue with how modernized vehicles are being added into the game. The differences between the version 2 and the version 3 Abrams is not just one piece of equipment. It's a collection of upgrades that come together to create their own version. So when the Trophy Abrams arrives with features that point toward a newer configuration, players are going to question what actually it is. A version 2 Abrams with trophy, or is it a version 3 being labeled as something else? That is the Abrams problem in War Thunder, because at this level of the game, details matter. The armor matters, the ammunition matters, the electronics provided matter, and even as much as the machine gun and crows matter, because every piece of the tank tells you what you're actually looking at. So, with that being said, I will be calling it a SEP V3. The biggest reason comes down to the upgrades that separate the SEP V3 from previous Abrams variants. The Abrams family is complicated because the United States has never replaced the tank completely. Instead, it has continuously upgraded the platform. That means the outside of the tank can look similar while the technology inside changes dramatically. The M1A2 SEP V2 was already a major improvement over previous Abrams models. But the SEP V3 took the platform further, with improvements to electronics, power management, survivability, and battlefield systems. And one of the biggest details people overlook is the Crow's remote weapon station. The Crow's is not just a different machine gun mount, it represents a change in how the tank operates. That is a major improvement. It improves survivability, it improves reaction time, it improves the commander's ability to engage targets without leaving the safety of the vehicle. And this is where my argument comes in. The vehicle is using equipment associated with a SEP V3 upgrade package, then calling it simply a version 2 does not make sense. A tank is not defined by one single feature, it is defined by the combination of the upgrades that make up the configuration. You cannot take a vehicle, add multiple systems from a newer modernization package, and then say it is still the previous version just because the base design is the same. That is not how military upgrades work. The Abrams has always been about evolution. The M1A1 became the M1A2. The M1A2 became the SEP became the SEP V2, and the SEP V2 became the SEP V3. Each version builds on the previous one with improvements designed to keep the platform relevant. So when we look at a trophy-equipped Abrams with features that align with a SEP V3 modernization path, it makes sense to identify it as a version 3. Now, some people will argue that the trophy itself does not make it a version 3, and technically, they are correct. The trophy active protection system alone does not automatically turn any Abrams into a SEP V3. But that is not the argument. The argument is the complete package. The trophy system combined with the other modernization features is what points toward the newer configuration. This is the same reason military enthusiasts pay attention to small details, the details that tell a story. A different sensor, a different electronic package, a different weapon station, a different protection system. Each one gives information about what version of the vehicle you are actually looking at. In War Thunder, those details matter even more, because the game is built around different vehicles competing against each other. A tank's equipment affects how it performs. Better awareness, better survivability, better ability to react. Those things change gameplay. The problem is that when a vehicle is introduced under a certain name, players expect the name to represent what they are actually getting. If it has the features of a newer variant, then the classification should reflect that. That is why I will continue calling the Trophy Abrams a version 3, because when you look at the overall configuration, it represents the direction of the SEP V3 upgrade package. It is not just an old Abrams with a new piece of equipment attached. It is a modernized Abrams built around newer technology. And this is where the discussion around the tank gets misunderstood. Some people think calling it a V3 is just asking for a stronger vehicle. Again, that is not the point. This is about accuracy. If we are going to have modern vehicles in a War Thunder game, then they should be represented correctly. Players should be able to look at the vehicle and understand what it is based on. A SEP V3 should not have the equipment capabilities that make it a SEP V3, if it is a SEP version 2. And if the Trophy Abrams fits that description, then that is the name it should be recognized by. At the end of the day, the Abrams is an extremely complicated platform because it has been upgraded for decades. But does that mean we should ignore the differences between these variants? No. The small details are exactly where they separate one generation from another. The Crow system is one of those details, the modernization upgrades are another, and when you put those pieces together, the argument becomes clear. The Trophy Abrams is not a version 2 with Trophy, it represents the next step in the Abrams family, the SEP V configuration. And that is why I will continually call it a version 3 Abrams. So with that being said, that is my piece on the Abrams trophy. We are simply looking at a SEP version 3, not a V2 as described in the panel. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe if you want. Stay tuned for the next video.